My parents ignored me my whole life until they found out I was a millionaire. They shipped me off to grandma's every time my sister sneezed, dismissed every achievement I made, and acted like I barely existed. Then they found out my little antique shop was a multi-million-dollar empire, and suddenly they expected a payday. Now, they're blocked, I'm thriving, and they'll never see a cent. I think I realized I was invisible the night my aunt shook me awake at 2 a.m. and told me to pack a bag. I was 8 years old. My mom was in the hospital, my new baby sister was arriving early, and everything was about to change. Before that night, my life had been pretty normal. My parents weren't overly affectionate, but they were present. Mom helped me with homework, Dad took me fishing once in a while. We weren't the Brady Bunch, but we were fine. Then Rachel was born and suddenly I wasn't their daughter, I was an afterthought. Rachel was premature, small enough to fit in the palm of my dad's hand, and hooked up to so many machines that she looked like one of my baby dolls, only fragile and real. Mom and Dad hovered over her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Me? I was standing by the door watching. At first I didn't question it. Rachel was tiny, sick, and needed extra care. But as the weeks passed, the pattern became obvious. Our house turned into a sterilized hospital room. Mom became obsessed with cleanliness, hand sanitizer stations in every room, industrial-strength disinfectant everywhere, the constant stench of bleach. And then came the worst part. Every time I so much as sneezed, I was banished. "Sweetie, you can't be around Rachel when you're sick," Mom would say before packing me off to Grandma Marie or Aunt Kelly's house. "One sneeze? Pack a bag. A mild cough? You're gone." At first, it felt like an adventure. Grandma Marie made the best cookies, and Aunt Kelly had an entire collection of Nancy Drew books I could lose myself in. But kids aren't stupid. After a while, I understood I wasn't being sent away on some fun sleepover. I was being removed. As if my very existence was a threat to my sister. I spent the next few years trying to win back their attention. If Rachel got all the love by being weak, maybe I could earn it by being strong, smart, and accomplished. Straight A's? Mom barely looked up from Rachel's doctor's schedule. Won first prize in the science fair? Dad told me to store my project in the garage because Rachel was allergic to cardboard dust. Is that even a real thing? Practiced for months for the school talent show? The night of the performance, Rachel had a mild fever and no one showed up for me. 2 weeks later, though, the whole family, including both sets of grandparents, showed up for Rachel's 15-minute flute recital, where she absolutely butchered hot cross buns. I sat in the audience watching my family clap and cheer for her, feeling like a ghost in my own home. Rachel learned to use the system early. By 7, she had outgrown most of her health problems, but that didn't stop her from milking it for everything she could. Headache? Day off school. Tired? I had to do her chores. Worried about a test? Mom called the school to get an extension. Meanwhile, I could be sick with the flu and still expected to clean my room, do my homework, and not complain. I stopped trying after a while. Instead, I hid in my room, burying myself in books about art, history, and antiques. It was the only place Rachel wouldn't invade because she claimed to be allergic to my lavender air freshener. Another lie, but I didn't mind, at least my room was mine. The worst part wasn't even the favoritism. It was how they rewrote history to justify it. Rachel needs more attention because she had a rough start. Sarah's always been so independent. Sarah understands that her sister has special needs. I didn't understand. I was just a kid, trying to figure out why having a good immune system made me less deserving of love. That feeling never really went away. But at least it taught me one thing: if no one else would cheer for me, I'd have to do it myself. By the time I hit high school, I had accepted the fact that nothing I did would ever be enough. I could get perfect grades, win awards, and push myself to the absolute limit, and my parents would still barely acknowledge my existence. Meanwhile, Rachel could so much as tie her shoes correctly, and they'd throw a celebration. At first, I kept trying. I thought that if I could just be the best at something, they'd finally see me. But it never worked. I still remember the day I got my SAT results. I had spent months preparing, studying late into the night, taking practice exams until my eyes burned. When I finally saw my score, 1600, a perfect score, I stared at the screen for a full 20 minutes, convinced there had to be some kind of mistake. Less than 1% of students achieve that. I ran home, excitement bubbling in my chest, thinking, just this once they'd be proud of me. I found Mom at the kitchen table, helping Rachel with her English homework. "Mom, look. I got a perfect SAT score." She barely glanced up. That's nice, honey, but can you keep it down? Rachel has a big test tomorrow. Rachel rolled her eyes. Yeah, some of us actually have to study, Miss Perfect. Mom smiled at her. Don't stress, sweetie. You're just a different kind of learner. That was it. A 1600 SAT score. Something that should have been a defining moment in my life was brushed off like it meant nothing. A week later, Rachel brought home a C+ in English, and it was put front and center on the fridge with the "We're so proud of you" magnet. That was the moment I realized I was truly alone. No one was coming to save me. No one was going to help me plan for my future. If I wanted a way out, I'd have to carve it out myself. So I did. I applied to 15 universities without telling anyone. I wrote my own essays, gathered my own recommendation letters, and handled all the financial aid applications by myself. My guidance counselor, Mr. Chun, was the only person who actually seemed to care. When my parents refused to help with the FAFSA forms, he stayed after school with me to fill them out. Then the acceptance letters started rolling in. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Michigan. Each one came with massive scholarship offers, full rides that covered tuition, room, board, and even books. I kept them all locked in a box under my bed, knowing what would happen if Rachel found them. She'd start crying about how if I left, she'd be all alone. And suddenly my parents would shift their focus to keeping me home. The day I got my official scholarship package from Michigan, Rachel had just joined JV cheerleading. Guess which one was celebrated with a family dinner? Hint. It wasn't me. While they went out to Olive Garden to celebrate Rachel's big achievement, I ate microwaved mac and cheese alone in my room, staring at the acceptance letter that was about to change my life. I finally told them over dinner a few weeks later. I got a full-ride scholarship to Michigan, I said, heart-pounding, waiting for some kind of reaction. Mom blinked. Michigan? But that's so far away. Dad frowned. You don't expect us to help with expenses, do you? Rachel's cheer competitions are expensive. Rachel gasped, eyes wide. Wait, if you leave, can I have your room? I need more space for my TikTok videos. I didn't even argue. I just nodded, swallowed my frustration, and let them think whatever they wanted. That summer, I worked double shifts at Carson's Diner, saving every penny I could. The owner, Carol, gave me extra tips and made sure I always got to take home leftover pie. She also taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my life. Baby, she said one night, wiping down the counter. In diners and in life, the ones making the most noise usually have the least to say. You keep your head down and your eyes open. You'll go far. Move-in day at Michigan came fast. My parents didn't even bother to show up. They had to take Rachel to a cheer competition. Instead, Aunt Kelly drove me, helped set up my dorm, and slipped me an envelope with $500 in cash. Grandma Marie wanted you to have this, she whispered. She's so proud of you. I learned later that Grandma had been saving that money for months, pulling from her Social Security checks just so I'd have a little extra to start my new life. That night, as I sat in my tiny dorm room, staring out at the campus, I made myself a promise. I was going to build a life so great that being overlooked would be impossible. Not to prove anything to my family, not to seek their approval, but for the 8-year-old girl who had been shipped off to Grandma's house for sneezing. I was going to be somebody, even if I had to do it alone. College felt like a breath of fresh air. A life without tiptoeing around Rachel's moods or my parents' indifference. I threw myself into my studies, balancing coursework with part-time jobs, pushing myself harder than ever, because I knew that no one was coming to save me. By the time I graduated summa cum laude, my parents barely noticed. They were too busy helping Rachel transfer to her third college in 2 years. I landed my first job at Everett and Phillips Auction House in Detroit, an old money, high-end firm dealing in estate sales, rare artifacts, and vintage jewelry. It wasn't glamorous. My days were spent cataloging dusty old furniture, porcelain sets, and antique trinkets from dead people's homes. But I was good at it, and I worked harder than anyone else. A few months in, I stumbled upon a brooch in an estate collection that changed everything. It looked like a simple Art Deco piece, tucked away in a box of what my supervisor had already labeled as costume jewelry. But something about it felt off: the weight, the detailing, the way the clasp worked. I spent my entire lunch break researching old jewelry hallmarks, and the more I dug, the more certain I became. This wasn't a replica. This was the real thing. For 2 weeks, I worked in secret, staying late, using the company's subscription to antique jewelry databases. Eventually, I found it, a 1925 Cartier brooch, part of a limited collection created for European royalty. If it was real, it wasn't just valuable. It was a damn treasure. I finally mustered the courage to approach my boss, Mr. Harrison, with my findings. He barely looked up from his phone. "Sarah, we've already cataloged that as costume jewelry." I held my ground. "Just look at these makers' marks. They match Cartier's 1925 signatures perfectly." That got his attention. He set down his phone, examined the photos I had printed, and then the brooch itself. The silence stretched for what felt like forever before he finally looked up. "Where did you learn all this?" "I did some research. The costume brooch sold for $47,000 at auction. That day everything changed. Harrison started trusting me. He gave me more and more authentication work, and I started gaining a reputation for spotting pieces others overlooked. My commissions grew. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was saving money. Meanwhile, my family still thought I was working in some antique shop scraping by. At Sunday dinners, the conversations were always the same. "Mom, Sarah's still at that little antique shop, right?" "Me, it's an auction house, actually, and yes." "Rachel, oh my God, speaking of jewelry, you guys have to see this charm bracelet I got at the mall." They never asked what I did, never cared. And maybe that was a blessing. Because while they were clueless, I was building something of my own. 2 years into the job, I was assigned to help catalog the Rothschild estate, an old money family with a jewelry collection that had been locked away for decades. That's where I spotted it, a seemingly unremarkable Art Nouveau pendant. Something about it nagged at me. I spent 3 days researching it obsessively, barely sleeping until I uncovered the truth. It wasn't just a pretty necklace, it was a lost piece from a famous French jeweler, believed to have been stolen during World War II. When it sold at auction for $238,000, Harrison called me into his office. I thought I was getting a promotion. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and said something that changed my life. "Sarah, you're wasting your talent here. You should be running your own authentication firm." At first, I laughed. Me? Start my own company? With what money? But the idea burrowed into my brain and refused to leave. I started taking on small freelance authentication jobs on the side, word spread, and private collectors started reaching out to me directly instead of going through the auction house. One night, sitting in my tiny apartment surrounded by printouts of antique hallmarks and certification guides, it hit me. I could actually do this. So I did what any sane person wouldn't. I emptied my savings, took out a loan against my car, and rented a tiny office above a Chinese restaurant in a sketchy part of town. People thought I was insane. Maybe I was. The office was barely bigger than a dorm room, smelled like Kung Pao chicken 24/7, and the Wi-Fi only worked if I sat in the corner by the window. But it was mine. For the first few months I barely slept, taking on every authentication job I could get, working until my eyes blurred. I lived in terror, constantly running calculations in my head. How many months until my savings ran out? How long before I had to give up? Then 6 months in, I hit my first big break. A dealer from the auction house called me up, asking if I could authenticate a Victorian-era brooch collection before they sold it. The collection was massive, spanning 3 generations of one family. I spent 2 weeks straight studying every single piece, and in the process I discovered 2 extremely rare items that had been misidentified as later replicas. The owner was so thrilled with my work that she not only paid my fee but also gave me a 10% commission on the sale. That commission? $86,000. More money than I had made in the past 2 years combined. After that, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Private collectors started seeking me out. Estate lawyers needed help identifying inherited jewelry. Even my old auction house began sending me authentication work. I'm pretty sure Harrison was secretly helping spread my name, thanks boss. Within 2 years, I hired my first employee, moved into a real office, and built a name for myself in the high-end jewelry industry. My company had a reputation for finding lost treasures, for spotting what others missed. Meanwhile, my family still thought I was barely scraping by in some dusty antique shop. Rachel once sneered, "Sarah, I have some old jewelry I was going to donate to Goodwill, maybe your little shop would want it." That same morning, I had authenticated a $1.2 million fabric piece. I just smiled and said, "Sure, I'll take a look." And that's when I realized something. Keeping my success a secret? That was actually kind of fun. By the time my company hit its 3rd year, I had more work than I could handle. Private collectors, estate lawyers, even international clients were coming to me for authentication. I had built a trusted reputation in the luxury jewelry world, and my commissions were getting bigger. The money was coming in faster than I ever imagined, and yet, back home, my family still thought I was just scraping by in some dusty antique shop. It was almost laughable how little they knew. I had moved my business to a real office downtown, hired a team of specialists, and even expanded into Chicago and New York. I was flying across the country, meeting with billionaires and museum curators, working with pieces that belonged in vaults, not jewelry boxes. My company was worth millions, but as far as my parents were concerned, I was still the disappointment, the daughter who hadn't done much with her life. They never asked questions, never showed interest. And honestly, that was fine with me, because keeping my success a secret felt like the biggest inside joke in the world. Every Sunday, I'd show up for family dinner wearing a plain sweater and jeans, listening to Rachel brag about her amazing life. She had some entry-level marketing job, but you'd think she was running a Fortune 500 company. She'd go on and on about her expensive designer bags and her luxury lifestyle, not realizing that the watch on my wrist was worth more than her car. One time, she spent 20 minutes showing off a $200 Michael Kors watch she got on sale. I sat there, sipping my wine, wearing a vintage Patek Philippe worth 6 figures, and no one noticed. The irony was delicious. Mom still introduced me to people as my other daughter. She works with old jewelry or something. Meanwhile, I had just closed a deal worth more than their entire house. The real kicker? I was quietly sending them money every month. One day, Aunt Kelly mentioned that my parents were struggling to pay Rachel's student loans and medical bills. Mom even hinted that they might have to sell the house. And as much as they had ignored me, dismissed me, and treated me like an afterthought, I couldn't just sit back and let them suffer. So I started sending anonymous monthly transfers $5,000 at first, then later $7,000. I told them I was barely making ends meet, living off ramen, sacrificing everything to help out. They assumed Aunt Kelly or some other relative was chipping in, and Rachel, of course, took full credit. One night at dinner, Mom beamed and said, "Rachel convinced the family to pitch in and help with the bills. Isn't she amazing?" Rachel flipped her hair and smiled, acting like she had done some great act of charity, while I just took another sip of my wine and enjoyed the irony. She started spending more extravagantly, new designer bags, weekend trips to Miami, fancy spa days, all while claiming she was struggling financially. I knew exactly where the money was coming from. And I said nothing. The longer I kept my secret, the more ridiculous it got. There I was running a multi-million-dollar company, making deals with collectors in Dubai and Hong Kong, and yet my parents were still worried about whether I was okay financially. Mom even pulled me aside one Sunday and said, "Sweetie, your clothes are looking a bit worn. Are you sure you're managing okay?" I was wearing a $3,000 cashmere sweater. Rachel, overhearing, smirked and said, "Well, if you'd gotten a real job instead of playing with old jewelry, maybe you wouldn't be struggling." That almost made me choke on my wine. I had never been more financially secure in my life, and they still thought I was barely getting by. But I let them believe it. Because honestly, it was hilarious. Every week, I'd sit at that dinner table, listening to Rachel talk about her boss, trusting her with big projects, while I was closing deals worth millions. Every time Dad said, "Maybe you should think about getting a real career," I had to fight back laughter. And every time Mom apologized to her friends for my simple lifestyle, I just smiled and nodded, knowing that I had more money sitting in my savings account than they could even imagine. I could have told them the truth at any time. I could have shut Rachel down, put my parents in their place, and made them realize how wrong they had been about me. But I didn't, because I wanted to see just how far the joke would go. Thanksgiving was always a big deal in my family, mostly because my mother insisted on cooking for 20 people despite the fact that she could barely season a turkey properly. But 2 weeks before the holiday, she called me in tears, saying her back pain was too much and she didn't know how she'd handle the cooking. I could have ignored it, could have let her struggle through another dry, overcooked disaster, but instead, I said, "Why don't I handle the food this year? I can have it catered." She immediately refused. "Honey, we can't afford a caterer." I forced myself not to laugh. "Don't worry about the cost. I've been saving up." She hesitated, then asked, "You're not taking out a loan for this, are you?" That was how I found myself secretly hiring a high-end catering company that I normally use for business events, the kind that served food so good it made you question why you ever bothered cooking at home. It cost more than my parents thought I made in 2 months, but whatever, I wasn't doing it for them, I was doing it for me because I was tired of pretending their Thanksgiving dinners were edible. The morning of Thanksgiving, I showed up early, laptop in tow because I had a major online auction in Hong Kong to monitor. I set up in my old bedroom, the one that had been left exactly the same since high school, while Rachel's room had gone through 3 renovations. When the catering team arrived, everything was set up perfectly: golden brown turkey, maple-glazed Brussels sprouts, truffle mashed potatoes, and a spread that looked straight out of a 5-star restaurant. My parents barely said thank you. Rachel wrinkled her nose and muttered, "Store-bought stuffing? Really? Mom's is so much better." This was coming from the same girl who once set off the smoke alarm making toast. I ignored it. I was too focused on my laptop tracking the auction. A stunning Art Nouveau necklace was on the bidding block, and I had a client eager to authenticate it if they won. I barely noticed when Rachel walked into my room because, of course, she never knocked. "Can I borrow your charger?" she asked, and before I could say no, she glanced at my screen. And that was where everything went wrong. Rachel's eyes scanned the multiple open tabs, all displaying various account balances, authentication contracts, and recent transactions. She froze, eyes locked on a particular number. Then she turned, a slow, wicked grin spreading across her face. "Let's show everyone what Sarah's really been up to." Before I could stop her, she grabbed my laptop and walked straight into the dining room, where 20 people were halfway through their meals. "Hey, everyone," Rachel announced, smug as ever. "Check out what Sarah does at her little antique shop." She spun my laptop around for everyone to see. Silence. I don't mean the awkward kind of silence. I mean the kind of silence where you can hear a clock ticking in the background, the scrape of a fork against a plate, the collective inhale of an entire room processing what they're seeing. Displayed on the screen in large, undeniable numbers. Current account balance, $12.4 million. Pending authentication contract, $485,000. Recent transaction, $1.2 million. Hong Kong auction quarterly profit report, $4.2 million. Rachel's face went through 5 different emotions in 3 seconds, cycling from triumph to confusion to absolute horror. She actually swayed on her feet, as if she had just discovered something physically painful. This can't be right," she stammered, her voice cracking. Mom blinked at the screen, still in denial. "Don't be silly. Sarah works at that little antique shop." I exhaled slowly, set down my fork, and straightened my sweater. The same sweater Mom had earlier pitted me for, not knowing it cost more than their monthly mortgage. "Actually, Mom, I own one of the largest jewelry authentication firms in the country." "The antique shop you've been laughing about? It has offices in 3 cities. I authenticate pieces worth millions." That was when the screaming started. Mom shot out of her chair so fast it fell over, her face turning bright red, then purple. "You have millions and you let us struggle?" Dad's voice was rough with shock. "We're your parents. We raised you. And you've been sitting on millions." Rachel burst into tears right on cue because of course she did. "You should have told me," she sobbed. "How could you keep this from your own family?" Not a single person said congratulations. Not a single person said, "Wow, we're proud of you." They were too busy being furious that I hadn't handed them a check. I felt years of buried resentment boiling to the surface. "Raised me?" I snapped. "You mean ship me off to Grandma's house every time I sneezed? Ignored every accomplishment I ever had because Rachel might feel left out? You never saved a penny for my college but took out loans for her private schools, and now you're mad that I built something for myself." Rachel was still crying, demanding to know how much I really had. Mom was yelling about family obligations. Dad was shouting about ungrateful children. Meanwhile, the catering staff awkwardly entered with dessert trays, looking like they wanted to evaporate into thin air. I had enough. I grabbed my laptop, slung my Hermes bag over my shoulder, the one Mom had once mistaken for a knockoff, and walked straight out the door. Behind me, I heard Mom frantically saying something about Rachel's MBA, about a new house, about how they needed to discuss how to use the money properly. They actually thought they were going to spend my money. As I drove home in my limited edition BMW, my phone started blowing up with messages. The family group chat exploded. Rachel was already posting on Facebook, ranting about hidden family wealth and betrayal. The harassment was just beginning. I barely made it home before the first call came in. "Mom." I let it go to voicemail. Then Dad. Then Rachel. Then Mom again. Then the group chat started blowing up. By the time I finally checked my phone, I had 47 missed calls and over 200 messages. The first few were just outrage, mom ranting about family loyalty, dad saying we needed to talk like adults, Rachel accusing me of betraying my own flesh and blood. Then the demands started. Mom, your sister deserves a share of your success. We're family. Dad, we raised you. It's time to give back. Rachel, I need at least $2 million to start my life properly. $2 million. As if I owed her a cent. It wasn't just them. Suddenly, relatives I hadn't spoken to in years started chiming in. Aunt Susan, who I saw maybe once every 3 years, called to tell me family is everything. Uncle Bob, who I was pretty sure still thought I was 12, emailed me a long lecture about sharing wealth. Even my third cousin's wife's sister, a woman I had never even met, somehow got my number and texted me about family responsibility. Meanwhile, Rachel had gone full meltdown on Facebook. She wrote a long, dramatic post about how she had always supported her sister, always tried to help me find my way, and how she was devastated to learn that I had been secretly rich while my family suffered. The comment section was a nightmare. Distant relatives, old classmates, random people I barely remembered from high school all weighing in, calling me selfish, greedy, heartless. Some even demanded I explain myself. Explain myself? For what? For working my ass off to escape a family that never gave a damn about me? Then came Monday morning. I walked into my office, my real downtown office, where my employees actually respected me, where I was seen as the expert I had worked so hard to become. Jenny, my receptionist, looked up at me, her expression tight. "They're here," she whispered. I barely had time to process what she meant before I saw them. Mom, Dad, Rachel, sitting in my reception area. Rachel was clutching her overpriced Michael Kors bag like a lifeline, Dad's arms were crossed, and Mom was already on the verge of fake tears. The moment they saw me, they stood up. "We need to talk," Dad said. I should have kicked them out right there. Should have told security to remove them. But some part of me, the part of me that had spent years hoping they'd change, hoping they'd finally see me, gave them 5 minutes. It was a mistake. Mom launched into it first. "We've discussed it as a family," she said, as if I hadn't been part of that family for the past 2 decades, "and we think it's only fair that you set up trust funds for everyone." Rachel jumped in next. "I need at least $2 million to start my new life properly." Dad, ever the negotiator, went for the long-term pitch. "Your mother and I would like to retire. We're thinking a beach house in Florida." I just stared at them. They weren't even trying to hide it. They weren't pretending this was about love or family or fairness. They saw dollar signs and decided I was their personal bank. I took a slow breath, keeping my voice calm. "Did you miss the part where I've been sending you $7,000 a month?" Rachel waved that off like it was pocket change. "That's nothing compared to what you have. You owe us." "Owe them? For what? For every school event they ignored? For every time I was sent away like an inconvenience? For the years of being invisible?" Mom sighed, like I was the one being difficult. "Sarah, we raised you. We gave you everything." I felt something inside me snap. "No," I said, my voice sharp. "I gave myself everything." Then before they could say another word, I pulled out my phone. Canceled the monthly transfers right in front of them. Mom gasped like I had slapped her. Rachel's mouth dropped open. Dad turned red. "You can't be serious." "I am," I said, slipping my phone back into my pocket. "You wanted money? Earn it yourselves." Rachel's fake crying stopped instantly when she realized it wasn't working. She stood up so fast her chair screeched against the floor. "You're selfish. You're a terrible daughter. Do you even know how hard my life has been?" I stared at her. This was the same girl who had spent years rubbing her privileged life in my face. The same girl who had bragged about vacations, designer bags, her parents' undivided love. And now she was playing the victim. For once I didn't feel anything. No anger. No guilt. No sadness. Just done. "I think we're finished here," I said, turning to Jenny. "Please call security." Watching my 60-year-old mother being dragged out of my office while yelling about ungrateful children was surreal. Rachel was still screeching about her ruined future when the door finally closed behind them. Jenny hesitated. "Do you want to press charges?" "No," I said. "But put their names on the do not admit list." She nodded, her expression unreadable. Then after a pause, she added, "Good for you." The harassment lasted weeks. New phone numbers. Fake email addresses. Even a few attempts to get through my company's customer service line. I had to send a formal legal notice threatening harassment charges before they finally gave up. Then Mom made her final move. She called Grandma Marie, thinking she'd take her side. Instead, Grandma Marie said, "Good for Sarah. About time someone in this family succeeded on their own terms." Mom didn't speak to her for 2 months. It had taken years to get to this point. Years of being overlooked, ignored, dismissed. Years of being seen as second best. But as I sat in my office that afternoon, finally free from their expectations, I felt lighter than I had in my entire life. I was done being their afterthought. Cutting them off should have been the end of it. I should have been able to move on, finally free of their entitlement, but instead, it was like setting off a bomb. The fallout was immediate, messy, and relentless. The calls and messages didn't stop. Mom, Dad, Rachel, every hour, every platform. I ignored them all, watching as the notifications stacked up into the hundreds. The family group chat exploded with guilt trips, accusations, and outrage over my selfishness. At one point, Mom sent me a single text. "I hope you're happy breaking up this family." Then came the social media meltdown. Rachel, in all her dramatic glory, went full victim mode on Facebook, posting a long, emotional rant about how her millionaire sister had been secretly hoarding wealth while her poor, struggling family suffered. She made it sound like I had been laughing in a throne made of cash while they were starving in the streets. The comment section turned into an absolute dumpster fire. Old classmates, distant relatives, even people I barely remembered from high school all jumped in with their hot takes on my character. Some called me selfish. Others said I have forgotten where I came from. A few messaged me directly, asking for money. Then there was the real insanity. Mom got Aunt Susan involved, who called me in the middle of the night, launching into a speech about family obligations. Uncle Bob, who I hadn't spoken to in 10 years, emailed me with a full financial breakdown of how I could spare at least $5 million to support my struggling parents. Then there was the third cousin's wife's sister, a woman I had never even met, who tracked down my work email just to send me a guilt-ridden message about remembering your roots. I blocked every single one of them. And then they showed up. It was Monday morning and Jenny, my receptionist, met me at the door with wide, wary eyes. "They're back," she whispered. I didn't even need to ask who. I walked into my office to find Mom, Dad, and Rachel sitting in my reception area. Rachel looked furious, Dad looked determined, and Mom was already working up tears. Jenny gave me a look. "Want me to call security?" I should have said yes. But instead, I gave them 5 minutes. It was a mistake. Mom started. "Sarah, we need to talk." I folded my arms. "No, you need money." Dad tried to sound rational, like he was being the reasonable one. "Your mother and I have thought about it, and we're not asking for much. We just want you to set up trust funds for the family." Rachel, always the entitled one, rolled her eyes. "I don't see what the big deal is. You have more than enough. Just transfer the money and we can move on." I felt my jaw tighten. "I don't owe you anything." Rachel's voice sharpened. "You're really going to stand there and act like we don't deserve a share?" "Deserve?" I almost laughed. "Deserve for what exactly?" Mom gasped, offended. "We raised you. We gave you everything." I let out a slow breath. "You raised me? You shipped me off to Grandma's every time I sneezed. You ignored me for years. You made sure Rachel had everything while I got nothing. And now, after never supporting me, you think you're entitled to what I build on my own." Rachel's voice turned shrill. "I need that money, Sarah. I have loans. I have expenses. You can't just keep it all for yourself." Dad stepped forward. "We're family. Families share." "No," I said, my voice calm. "Families care. And you never cared about me." Then, in front of them, I pulled out my phone and made sure the monthly payments were permanently canceled. Mom gasped like I had physically hurt her. Rachel's face twisted with fury. "You ungrateful bitch." That was it. I turned to Jenny and nodded. "Call security." Watching 2 security guards escort them out of my office while Mom wailed about betrayal, and Rachel shouted about her ruined future, was surreal. Jenny waited until the door slammed shut, then turned to me. "Do you want to press charges?" I thought about it. Thought about how easy it would be to take legal action, to make sure they never pulled something like this again. But instead I just said, "No. Just put them on the do not admit list." Jenny nodded, then hesitated before saying, "Good for you." The harassment lasted a few more weeks. Fake phone numbers. Anonymous emails. Even a few calls to my company's customer service line trying to get through to me. It finally ended when I had my lawyer send them a formal legal notice. Then Mom played her final card. She called Grandma Marie. But Grandma Marie, the only decent person in our entire family, just said, "Good for Sarah. About time someone in this family did something on their own." Mom didn't speak to her for 2 months. I had spent years trying to prove myself, years trying to earn their love, years hoping that one day they'd finally see me. But as I sat in my office, looking out at the city skyline, I realized something. I didn't need them to see me. I didn't need them at all. For the first time in my life, I was free.